The envelope felt out of place the moment I pulled it from the mailbox. It was too heavy, too formal, the thick, cream-colored stock a stark contrast to the usual barrage of catalogs and bills. The return address, a P.O. box I didn't recognize, was printed in an elegant, almost smug font. I stood on the porch of our quiet, modern home, the late afternoon sun warming the back of my neck, and turned it over in my hands. The scent of freshly cut grass from my own lawn mingled with the distant, earthy smell of the woods that bordered our property. It was a piece I'd built, a life of order and intention, and this envelope felt like a whisper from a chaotic past I'd long since filed away. Inside, the air was cool and still. The open floor plan Jenna had designed allowed the light to flood the living space, glinting off the polished concrete floors. I dropped my keys into the ceramic bowl by the door, the familiar clink a sound of arrival, of safety. I slid my thumb under the flap of the envelope, the paper resisting with a soft tear. The invitation inside was even more ornate than the envelope promised. Hillside High Class of 2013 15-year reunion. It declared in swirling script. Below, the details were laid out with a kind of pompous grandeur. A Saturday night 3 weeks away at the Grand Heritage Hotel, black tie optional, a buffet dinner, and memory lane slideshow. A memory lane I had no particular desire to walk down again. A photograph was tucked into the fold, a glossy reproduction of our senior class picture. Rows of young, hopeful, and anxious faces stared back at me. It was like looking at ghosts. My own face was there, tucked away in the back row near the left edge. A kid with glasses that were slightly too big for his face, hair that refused to be styled, trying his best to be invisible. I found Brad Thompson immediately, of course. Front and center, his quarterback smile already a polished tool, and arms slung around Chloe Richardson, who was beaming with a practiced, photogenic grace. They were the sun around which our high school universe orbited. And then I found myself again, a blurry smudge in the background. The intern. Something interesting? Jenna's voice came from the hallway, followed by the soft sound of her footsteps. She emerged from her home office, stretching her arms above her head. She still had that focused, slightly abstracted look she gets when she's deep in a design, a pencil tucked behind her ear. Or just another credit card offer promising to change our lives. More like an offer to revisit a life I'd rather forget, I said, handing her the invitation. She took it, her architect's eyes scanning the details quickly, missing nothing. A smile played on her lips. 15 years? God, that makes me feel ancient. The Grand Heritage, huh? They're aiming high. She looked up at me, her head tilted. So, are we going? I let out a breath I didn't realize I'd been holding and walked over to the large window that looked out onto the backyard. Our yard. My hands found their way into my pockets, a familiar posture. I don't know, Jen. What's the point? The point is free rubber chicken and a chance to see if anyone else has gone bald, she said, her tone light but her eyes, as always, perceptive. She came to stand beside me, her shoulder brushing mine. And maybe to show that kid in the back row how far he's come. I looked down at her. Jenna had never known that version of me. She met me after basic, after airborne school, when the Army had already started sanding down my rough edges and building something new underneath. She saw the man I was, not the boy I had been. To her, my stories about high school were just that, stories, like tales from a foreign country I'd once visited. They called me the intern, I said, the old nickname feeling strange and small in the quiet safety of our home. The intern, she repeated, a frown creasing her brow. That sounds administrative. That was the point. It was meant to be dismissive. My big claim to fame senior year was that I got a clerical internship at the Regional Department of Motor Vehicles office. 3 afternoons a week, I'd file paperwork, sort mail, make copies. It was mind-numbing, but it was quiet, and it got me out of the house. To Brad Thompson and his crowd, it was the most laughably pathetic thing they could imagine. While they were talking about college parties and spring break trips, I was spending my time alphabetizing Form 804B. The memory was a dull ache, not a sharp pain. The humiliation had faded, leaving behind a residue of what? Not anger, exactly. More a profound sense of dislocation. Jenna was quiet for a moment, studying my face. And this Brad guy was the one who gave you the nickname. He was the ringleader, but it stuck because it was accurate. I was quiet. I did my work. I kept my head down. I was, for all intents and purposes, an intern in my own life. I turned away from the window and picked up the class photo again, pointing to a face near mine, a guy with a mop of black hair and an impish grin. The only one who ever made it bearable was David Chen. He was the only one who thought the whole intern thing was hilarious. He'd ask me for government secrets just to get a rise out of me. "I like him already," Jenna said. "Is he going?" "I have no idea. We lost touch after graduation." I tossed the photo back onto the counter. It just feels like stepping backward. Why would I want to go back to a room full of people who only knew the weakest version of me? "Maybe," Jenna said softly, moving to stand in front of me, her hands resting on my chest. "But that's not the version of you they'll see. They'll see a United States Army Ranger, a man who built this." She gestured around our home. "They'll see you with me. And if this Brad guy is still a condescending jerk, then you get the satisfaction of knowing you turned out better, and we get a good story out of it. We're going." It wasn't a question anymore. It was a statement. That was Jenna's support, not a gentle suggestion, but a confident assertion of my own strength, a strength she saw more clearly than I sometimes did. She believed in the man I was so completely that she couldn't conceive of me being intimidated by shadows from 15 years ago. Later that night, after Jenna had fallen asleep, her breathing a soft, steady rhythm beside me, I got out of bed. The house was silent, bathed in the pale blue light of the moon. I padded across the cool floor to my dresser and opened the top drawer. Beneath neatly folded t-shirts, my fingers found what they were looking for, a small, rectangular piece of cloth folded with care. I carried it to the window and held it in my palm. It was my Ranger tab, the black and gold threads woven together. I didn't need the moonlight to see it. I knew every stitch by heart. The weight of it in my hand was more than physical. It was the weight of every mile of road march, every sleepless night in the woods, every moment of pain and doubt forged into a single, unbreakable truth. This small piece of cloth was a receipt for a price paid in full. It was the antithesis of the intern. But as I stood there, the past didn't feel so distant. The invitation had pulled a thread, and a memory, vivid and sharp, unraveled in the quiet dark. The smell hit me first, a nauseating cocktail of industrial cleaner, greasy pizza, and the cloying sweetness of body spray. The Hillside High cafeteria was a cacophony of shouting, clattering trays, and the shrill laughter of teenagers trying too hard. I moved through it like a ghost, my tray held tight against my chest, a shield against the chaos. My destination was the table in the far corner, near the emergency exit, where David Chen was already holding court. Our table. The island of misfit toys, as David liked to call it. It was a motley crew, a couple of band kids, a girl who was obsessed with anime, David and me. It was safe territory. But today, my path was blocked. Brad Thompson's group had spread out, taking over the aisle. He was holding forth, as usual, surrounded by Chloe Richardson and the rest of the varsity crowd. Brad was all sharp angles and practiced charm, his Letterman jacket a uniform of its own. Chloe was perched on the table next to him, swinging her legs, her smile bright and effortless. I tried to slip past, to make myself small, but Brad's eyes, sharp and seeking a target, landed on me. "Well, if it isn't the man from the government," he said, his voice cutting through the din. A few people turned to look. My face grew warm. "Thorne, just the guy I wanted to see." I stopped, my grip tightening on the tray. "Brad." He leaned forward, a conspiratorial grin on his face. "I need some inside info. My dad's got a new Beamer, right? A sweet 3 Series. I'm trying to get these sweet vanity plates. I want BRAD a man. You think you can pull some strings down at the DMV, get it pushed through? You've got the connections, right?" Chloe giggled, a sound like breaking glass. "Oh my God, Brad, that's perfect." The laughter around them was a physical pressure. I could feel David's eyes on me from across the room, but I couldn't look at him. I knew he'd be making a face, ready with a sarcastic retort, but in that moment, I was alone in the spotlight. "I just file paperwork, Brad," I mumbled, looking at the floor. "Come on, man," Brad pressed, his tone shifting from mock-friendly to condescending. "Don't be modest. We all know you're the big shot intern. You've got your finger on the pulse of the state bureaucracy. Surely you can do a favor for an old friend." We were not friends. We had never been friends. I was a prop in his ongoing performance of superiority. "I can't," I said, my voice barely audible. "It doesn't work like that." Brad sighed dramatically, as if I deeply disappointed him. All right, no worries, I guess I'll have to wait in line with the commoners. He turned back to his friends, dismissing me. Guess some people just don't have any pull. The laughter resumed as I shuffled away, my face burning. I finally reached the corner table and slid into a chair beside David. Jesus, Thorne, you're redder than the ketchup packet, David said, not unkindly. He shoved a cookie towards me. Here, sugar helps with the sting of existential humiliation. I took the cookie but didn't eat it. I hate that guy. Everyone with an IQ above room temperature hates that guy, David said through a mouthful of his own cookie. He's a clown. The problem is, the circus is in town and everyone's buying tickets. Don't let him get to you. You're getting out of here. You've got a plan. I did have a plan. It was the only thing that got me through the days. The plan was basic, simple, and mine. Graduate, get through the summer, ship out to Fort Benning. The plan was a secret I carried deep inside, a quiet rebellion against the Brad Thompsons of the world. They could have their glory days. I was aiming for something else entirely. Yeah, I said, finally meeting his eyes. I've got a plan. David nodded. Good, now eat your cookie before I do. And for the record, the intern is a badass nickname. Way cooler than Bradman. Sounds like a secret agent. I managed a weak smile. David's loyalty was a lifeline. But as I sat there, the echo of Brad's laughter still ringing in my ears, the plan felt very far away, and the label, the intern, felt like a brand I would never escape. The memory faded, leaving me standing once again in the moonlit silence of my bedroom. The greasy smell of the cafeteria was replaced by the clean scent of our home. The roar of the crowd was gone, replaced by Jenna's soft breathing. I looked from the Ranger tab in my hand to the man reflected in the dark window, a man with calm eyes, a solid frame, and a stillness that had been earned, not inherited. I had escaped. I had become the man that quiet, overlooked kid had desperately hoped he could be. The plan had worked. I folded the tab carefully and placed it back in its drawer. A touchstone returned to its place. I climbed back into bed, the cool sheets a comfort. Jenna stirred slightly, murmuring something in her sleep before settling again. As I lay there in the dark, the apprehension I'd felt earlier began to solidify into something else. Resolve. Jenna was right. This wasn't about going back. It was about arriving. It was about closing a loop. Brad Thompson and Chloe Richardson were still out there, probably in a house that looked like a magazine spread, living a life that was all surface. And I was here, a ranger, a husband, a man who had built a life with his own two hands. I wasn't that scared kid in the cafeteria anymore. I had nothing to prove to anyone, least of all to them. But a small, quiet part of me, the part that still remembered the sting of that laughter, acknowledged a simple truth. It wouldn't be the worst thing in the world to let them see that the intern had, in fact, been running a very different kind of operation all along. The chapter on Hillside High had been closed for 15 years. Maybe it was time to write a brief, definitive epilogue. The heavy oak doors of the Grand Heritage Hotel's ballroom swung inward, and the past hit me like a physical force. It wasn't just the sound, a dull, percussive roar of 100 conversations competing with a painfully generic pop song from our graduation era, but the smell. A cloying mix of perfume, cologne, and the faint, waxy scent of buffed floors. It was the same sensory overload I remembered from the senior prom, an event I'd attended alone, lingering near the punch bowl as a silent observer. Jenna's hand found mine, her fingers lacing through my own. Her touch was a grounding wire, a tether to the present. Okay, she said, her voice low and steady beside me. Deep breath. It's just a room full of people who used to know you. That's what I'm afraid of, I murmured, my eyes scanning the scene. The ballroom was exactly as I dreaded. A disco ball spun lazily overhead, casting fractured specks of light over round tables draped in black cloth. A banner strung across the far wall proclaimed, "Welcome back, OAKWOD High Class of 2009, in glittering silver letters that felt aggressively cheerful. Clusters of people were already formed, their body language speaking volumes. The athletic crowd, slightly thicker around the middle but still carrying themselves with a familiar swagger, dominated the space near the open bar. The former theater kids were more animated, their laughter a few decibels louder. I saw the same hierarchies, the same invisible magnetic fields pulling certain people together and repelling others, all preserved in amber for 15 years and then thawed for one night. I felt the old instinct to shrink, to find a shadowed corner and make myself small. The uniform I wore now was nothing like the ill-fitting polo shirts and khakis of my youth, but the ghost of that boy, the quiet intern with his head down, hoping to go unnoticed, stirred uneasily within me. "Let's find our table," Jenna suggested, her architect's eye already cataloging the room, identifying traffic patterns and exit routes. She gave my hand a slight pull, and I let her lead me into the fray. We weaved through the crowd, a sea of vaguely familiar faces attached to names I had to scramble to recall. The years had been kind to some, harsh to others. There was a strange dissonance in seeing the teenage features I remembered superimposed on the faces of adults. We were nearing a table near the back when a voice, warm and unmistakable, cut through the din. "Thorne, I don't believe it. You actually showed up." I turned to see David Chen grinning, a bottle of beer clasped in his hand. Time had been good to him. He'd lost the lanky awkwardness of his teens, filling out into a comfortable, confident frame. He wore a crisp button-down shirt, but his smile was the same, a little bit mischievous, a lot genuine. "David," I said, the tension in my shoulders easing for the first time since we'd parked the car. We clasped hands in a brief, firm shake that turned into a quick, backslapping hug. I said I'd think about it. "Thinking about it is your default state, Marcus." I took it as a solid maybe. He turned his smile to Jenna. "And you must be the legendary Jenna, the woman who managed to drag this hermit out of his cave. I've heard stories." Jenna laughed, a warm, easy sound that drew a real smile from me. "All true, I'm sure. It's great to finally meet you, David. Marcus has told me a lot about you." "Only the good parts, I hope. Mostly about how I was the sole source of levity in his otherwise bleak high school existence." He gestured to the empty chairs at his table. "Please, join me. Save me from dying of acute nostalgia poisoning. I've already been cornered by Mrs. Gable, the biology teacher. She still smells like formaldehyde and disappointment." We sat, and a genuine sense of calm settled over me. This was the only person here, besides Jenna, with whom I had no history of social transactions, no unspoken debts or rivalries. With David, it had always been simple. "So," David said, leaning forward, 15 years, you look exactly the same but harder, like you've been sandblasted." He squinted. "Still quiet, though." "Still talking enough for both of us, I see," I replied dryly. "Someone has to. Seriously, man, it's good to see you." His tone softened, the humor giving way to sincerity. "What have you been up to? Last I heard, you were away." I gave him the abbreviated version I'd rehearsed in my head. "Did a stint in the army, got out, now I'm back." "Army, huh?" David's eyebrows shot up. I should have guessed. The whole disciplined, strong and silent thing makes a lot more sense now. Not exactly the career path I pictured for the guy who alphabetized the filing cabinet in the principal's office for fun. It wasn't for fun, it was an internship. Semantics. He took a swallow of his beer. "I'm in software. Shockingly, I know, still solving puzzles just for a lot more money. It's good, boring but good." For a few minutes, it was easy. We fell into the old rhythm, David carrying the conversation with witty observations about the room while Jenna and I listened, interjecting occasionally. He pointed out former classmates, updating us with snippets of gossip he'd already collected. He was a keen observer, and his commentary was sharp but never mean. It was a pocket of normalcy in the otherwise surreal evening. Jenna engaged with him effortlessly, asking about his work, his life, and I felt a surge of gratitude for both of them, for David's unwavering friendship and for Jenna's ability to seamlessly integrate into this fragment of my past. The bubble of comfort was punctured by a voice that was, if possible, even more polished and self-assured than it had been in high school. "Well, well, look what the cat dragged in. Marcus Thorne. I saw the name on the list and had to see it for myself." Brad Thompson stood over our table, a practiced smile plastered on his face. He looked like a catalog model for successful suburban husbands. His blonde hair was still perfectly styled, though perhaps with a little more product to maintain the effect, and his athletic build had softened into the solidity of a man who played golf for business. He wore a blazer that was just a shade too bright, and his watch was a heavy, expensive-looking piece of steel and gold that he made sure was visible as he rested a hand on the back of a chair. Chloe was beside him, a vision in a sleek blue dress, her smile bright and vacant. "Brad, Chloe," I said, nodding. Jenna's posture shifted subtly beside me, straightening from its relaxed state into something more poised, more ready. "It's been forever," Chloe chirped. "You look great, Marcus." Her eyes flicked to Jenna, assessing her outfit with a quick, professional sweep. "And you must be." "Jenna," I said, "my wife." "Oh, how lovely," Chloe's smile widened. "It's so nice to meet you." Brad's attention, however, remained fixed on me. He had that look in his eyes, the same one he'd get before asking a question in class he knew I wouldn't be able to answer, the look that said he was about to re-establish the natural order of things. The king confirming his reign. "So Marcus," he began, rocking back on his heels slightly. He gestured vaguely around the opulent ballroom, a space that probably reminded him of a successful closing dinner. "Quite a change from the old days, huh? I have to ask, man, we're all dying to know." He paused for effect, ensuring he had the attention of our small group. "Do you still work for the government?" The question hung in the air, dripping with the same condescension I remembered. It was designed to pigeonhole me, to reduce the last 15 years of my life to that mundane internship, to remind everyone present, especially me, of my place. I saw David tense, his jaw tightening. I felt Jenna's hand, which had been resting on my leg, give a slight, encouraging press. I took a slow sip of my water, placing the glass back on the table with deliberate calm. The noise of the room seemed to recede, fading into a dull hum. This was it. The moment I had dreaded and on some level anticipated. I met Brad's gaze, my own expression neutral. "No," I said, my voice even and quiet, but carrying clearly. "I did an internship in high school. After that, I spent 12 years as an Army Ranger. I got out as a Master Sergeant last year." The change in the air was immediate and palpable. Brad's slick smile froze, then twitched at the corners. His eyes, which had been glazed with feigned interest, sharpened with surprise. The casual, condescending posture he'd affected stiffened. He'd been expecting to lob a soft, slightly pitying question at the quiet guy from the nerd table. He hadn't expected a concrete, unassailable fact that completely shattered his narrative. "A Ranger," he repeated, the word sounding foreign and heavy on his tongue. He blinked. "Seriously?" "Seriously," I said. Chloe was the first to recover. Her superficial pleasantness was replaced by a spark of genuine, almost predatory curiosity. Her eyes widened, looking at me as if she were seeing me for the first time. The shy intern was gone, replaced by someone far more interesting. "An Army Ranger? Wow, Marcus. That's incredible. That must have been so intense." Brad, still off balance, scrambled to regain control of the conversation. "Well, hell, that's not what I expected. So what do you do now? Private security? Contractor?" He said it as if these were the only logical conclusions, attempts to fit my new identity into a box he could understand. "I'm exploring my options," I said, leaving it deliberately vague. I had no interest in giving him more ammunition, no desire to talk about the quiet consulting work I was starting to pick up. The victory wasn't in boasting, it was in the quiet assertion of truth. David couldn't suppress a snort of laughter, which he quickly tried to disguise as a cough into his fist. He shot me a look of pure, unadulterated glee. Jenna's hand found mine again under the table, and she gave it a firm, proud squeeze. Her shoulder pressed against mine, a solid, unwavering presence. "Well, good for you, man," Brad said, the words coming out forced. The condescension was gone, replaced by a flustered bewilderment. He'd lost the high ground, and he knew it. "That's really something. Come on, Chloe, we should go say hi to the Petersons." He needed to retreat, to find a conversation he could dominate. Chloe, however, seemed reluctant to leave. "It was so great seeing you, Marcus," she said, her voice warmer, more personal. "And so nice to meet you, Jenna. We should all catch up properly later." Her gaze lingered on me for a moment longer before she allowed Brad to steer her away, back into the safety of the crowd. The three of us sat in silence for a moment, watching them disappear. David let out a low whistle. "Holy crap, Marcus, you just used words as a tactical weapon. I haven't seen Brad Thompson look that stupid since he tried to explain photosynthesis in Mr. Henderson's class." He grinned, raising his bottle in a mock toast. "Do you still work for the government?" Classic. And you just, boom, dropped it on him like a bunker buster. That was beautiful. I felt a faint warmth in my cheeks, not from embarrassment, but from a strange, unfamiliar sense of validation. I hadn't wanted a confrontation, but now that it was over, I felt a quiet solidity. I hadn't been trying to win, I had simply refused to lose on his terms. Jenna leaned her head against my shoulder. "I'm so proud of you," she whispered, her words meant only for me. The rest of the evening passed in a different key. The interaction with Brad and Chloe seemed to have sent a ripple through the room. People who had glanced over me with vague recognition now looked twice. A few, emboldened by what they had undoubtedly overheard or been told, came over to our table to say hello. The conversations were different now. They didn't ask what I'd been up to, with the faint pity of someone expecting a disappointing answer. They asked about my service with a respectful, almost cautious curiosity. The invisible boy from the class photo had suddenly become visible, but on his own terms. I saw Brad across the room, holding court by the bar, but his laughter seemed louder, more performative. He glanced in my direction a few times, a faint frown creasing his brow. The king had been subtly, quietly challenged, and the foundation of his court felt a little less stable. Chloe, meanwhile, was deep in conversation with a group of women, and I saw her gesture toward our table, her expression animated. She was no longer just the popular girl. She was a social archaeologist who had just discovered a fascinating new artifact. As the night wore on and the music shifted to slower songs, I led Jenna onto the dance floor. It was something I would never have dreamed of doing 15 years ago. But holding her close, feeling the steady rhythm of her breath, the world outside our small space faded away. The disco ball's light speckled her dark hair, and she looked up at me, her eyes full of a quiet, fierce love. "You see," she said softly, her voice barely audible over the music. "It was just a room, and you're not who you were." I nodded, pulling her closer. She was right. The ghosts were still there, whispering from the corners, but they had lost their power. The past hadn't changed, but I had. The weight of the old hierarchies was still present, a faint pressure in the air, but it was a weight I could finally bear. I had walked in fearing the judgment of a ghost, and had instead laid that ghost to rest with a simple, quiet truth. The reunion wasn't an intrusion anymore. It was a line of demarcation, and I had just crossed it. The clatter of cutlery and the low hum of 100 conversations wrapped around me like a suffocating blanket. We were seated at a round table draped in a stiff white cloth, right in the center of the room. Jenna's doing, of course. She'd steered us here with a quiet determination, her hand a warm, steady pressure on the small of my back. To my left, David Chen was already dissecting the rubbery chicken with surgical precision, a familiar, wry grin playing on his lips. 15 years, he muttered, leaning toward me. And the culinary standards of the Grand Royal Hotel have remained impressively consistent with a high school cafeteria. I'm getting flashbacks to Mystery Meatloaf. I managed a tight smile, my own food largely untouched. The initial shock of entering the lion's den had subsided, replaced by a low-grade, persistent buzz of anxiety. I kept my posture straight, my hands resting on my thighs under the table, a habit drilled into me to project calm even when my insides were churning. I was a 33-year-old man, a soldier who had led men through terrain that would break most people. Yet the social geography of this ballroom felt more treacherous than any mountain pass in Afghanistan. Across from us, Brad Thompson held court. He had commandeered the conversation as naturally as he'd once commanded the huddle on the football field. Chloe sat beside him, nodding along, her smile a perfect, polished accessory. Brad's stories were all about closings and commissions, about the big fish he'd landed in commercial real estate. Each anecdote was a brick in the wall of his success, a fortress of status he was building for everyone to see. And the client, this big-shot developer from Chicago, he looks me dead in the eye and says, "Brad, I've talked to 5 other agents. Why should I go with you?" Brad paused for effect, his gaze sweeping around our table, which included a few other classmates whose names I was still struggling to recall. And I just leaned back and said, "Because the other guys are playing checkers. I'm playing chess." Closed the 7-figure deal the next week. A few people murmured appreciatively. Brad's eyes landed on me, a glint of challenge in them. "What about you, Thorne? Last I heard, you were doing some kind of government work, right? Filing paperwork or something?" He said it with a jovial chuckle, but the intent was as sharp as a knife. It was the same old Brad, needing to establish his dominance to remind everyone of the old hierarchy. The shy kid with the clerical internship was a safe target. Before I could form a response, Jenna's voice cut through, calm and clear as a bell. Marcus's work is a little more hands-on than filing, Brad. She didn't look at him. She was smoothing her napkin on her lap, but her tone left no room for argument. David chimed in, his voice dripping with mock seriousness. "Oh, I don't know, Brad. I hear the government has some pretty intense filing systems. Classified filing requires a certain disposition." He shot me a quick, supportive glance. Brad waved a dismissive hand, though I saw a flicker of irritation in his eyes. "Hey, no disrespect. Solid career. Stable. A guy's gotta provide, right? Not all of us can be quarterbacks." He laughed again, a hollow sound that grated on my nerves. It was the same condescension, just wrapped in the thinner skin of adulthood. He was painting my service as a default, a path for those without the charisma or cleverness for his world of high-stakes deals. The conversation shifted, but the slight hung in the air around me. I felt the old instinct to shrink, to become invisible. But then I felt Jenna's knee pressed gently against mine under the table. A tiny, secret point of contact, a reminder of who I was now. I took a slow, deliberate breath, the kind I'd take before a patrol, centering myself. The noise of the room seemed to recede slightly. Later, as a server cleared the main course plates, a woman sitting next to David, Sarah, I think her name was, leaned forward. She had a kind, open face and had been listening quietly. "So, Marcus," she said, her voice genuinely curious, "Jenna said you're in the army? What is it that you actually do?" Brad, who was in mid-sentence about his new sports car, went quiet, his attention snapping back to our end of the table. I could feel his stare. This was it, a direct question. A chance to correct the record, not for glory, but for simple accuracy. I looked at Sarah, keeping my voice low and even. "I'm an Army Ranger," I said. "Oh, like Special Forces?" she asked, her eyes widening slightly. "Something like that?" I paused, choosing my words carefully. I wouldn't boast, I would just state facts. It's mostly about endurance, problem-solving under pressure. Brad couldn't resist. "Yeah, I saw a documentary on that. Ranger school, right? Looked tough, lots of hiking." He said hiking the way another person might say coloring. I felt a muscle in my jaw tight. Jenna started to speak, but I placed my hand over hers on the tablecloth, a silent signal that I had this. I turned to Brad, meeting his gaze for the first time all night. My voice was still quiet, but it carried a new weight. "It's not hiking, Brad. It's 61 days of sustained operational missions on minimal food and sleep. The average day is over 20 hours long. You learn to lead exhausted men through impossible problems. You learn about your own breaking point and how to function well beyond it." The table had gone quiet, even Chloe had stopped fussing with her necklace. Sarah was watching me, rapt. "The point isn't the hardship," I continued, more to her than to Brad. "The point is the trust, knowing the man next to you has been through the same crucible, that he won't break when it matters. That's what the tab means. It's not a badge for hiking." I hadn't raised my voice. I hadn't needed to. The simple, unvarnished truth of it filled the space more effectively than any of Brad's bluster. Brad opened his mouth to retort, but just then, the DJ cranked up the music and the event organizer, a woman named Mrs. Gable, who had been our ancient history teacher, tapped on the microphone at the podium. Hello. If I could have your attention for some quick announcements, and then we'll have a few words from one of our own, Brad Thompson." Brad's face lit up, the momentary tension broken. He straightened his tie and shot me a triumphant look. His moment in the sun was arriving right on schedule. Mrs. Gable made some announcements about a memorial fund for a teacher who had passed away, and then, with a flourish, she handed the microphone to Brad. He strode to the podium, oozing the same easy confidence he'd had at 18. 15 years, he boomed, and a cheer went up. He launched into a speech that was part stand-up routine, part tribute to the glory days. He told stories about football games and parties, name-dropping the popular kids, reinforcing the very social structure this night was supposedly about moving beyond. It was a masterclass in nostalgia, designed to make everyone feel like they were still part of the in-crowd, or at least grateful for the proximity. He was nearing the end, raising his glass for a toast. "So let's raise a glass to the class of 2008, The best damn class this school ever saw. May the next 15 years be even." His words were cut off by a sharp, collective gasp from a table near the front. A chair scraped loudly and clattered to the floor. All heads turned. Mr. Henderson, our former biology teacher, a man in his late 70s now, was slumped forward in his seat, his face a ghastly shade of gray. The woman next to him was patting his back frantically, her voice shrill with panic. "Arthur, Arthur, someone help." For a split second, the room froze. The thumping bass of the music felt obscene. 100 people stared, a collective deer-in-the-headlights moment of confusion and fear. Then something else took over. The years of training, the countless drills for scenarios far more chaotic than this, kicked in. The buzzing anxiety in my veins vanished, replaced by a cold, clear focus. I was moving before I had even fully formed the thought. I stood, my chair pushing back silently. I didn't run, but my walk was purposeful and fast, cutting through the stunned crowd. "Call 911. Now," I said, my voice cutting through the panic, not loud, but absolute. A man at the next table fumbled for his phone. I reached Mr. Henderson's side. The woman, his wife I presumed, was crying now. He couldn't breathe. "Ma'am, I need you to move back, please. Give him space." I placed a hand on her shoulder, guiding her gently but firmly away. My touch was calm, and she responded to the authority in it, allowing herself to be led back a step. I knelt beside Mr. Henderson. I checked for responsiveness, tapping his shoulder. "Mr. Henderson, can you hear me?" No response. His breathing was agonal, shallow, and ineffective. I felt for a carotid pulse. It was thready and rapid. I lowered him carefully from the chair to the carpeted floor, tilting his head back to open his airway. The world had shrunk to this single point. The man on the floor, the vital signs, the next step. "I need a clear path from the main doors to here," I announced, my voice steady. "Everyone, move your chairs back." People scrambled to comply. The crowd was a blur at the edge of my vision. I was aware of Jenna shepherding people back, creating the corridor I'd asked for. David was already at the ballroom doors, flagging down the paramedics we could now hear in the distance. I began CPR. The compressions were automatic, the rhythm a brutal metronome. 30 compressions, 2 breaths. My dress shirt felt tight across my shoulders. The only sound was the harsh gasp of my own breathing and the rhythmic thump of my palms on his sternum. Time distorted. It could have been 30 seconds or 3 minutes. I was aware of nothing else but the count in my head, the feel of the compressions, the hope for a pulse. Then a hand touched my shoulder. "We've got it, sir." I looked up into the calm, professional faces of 2 paramedics. They moved with an efficiency I recognized. I immediately shifted back, giving them room, quickly relaying what I knew in clipped, clinical terms. Unresponsive. Agonal respirations. Weak carotid pulse, approximately 130. CPR initiated for approximately 90 seconds. They nodded, taking over. As they worked, attaching leads, starting an IV, I finally became aware of the room again. The music had been cut. 100 pairs of eyes were fixed on me, but the silence wasn't accusatory or mocking anymore. It was heavy with a profound, stunned respect. I stood up, wiping my brow with the back of my hand. My knuckles were sore. Jenna was suddenly at my side, her arms slipping around my waist. She didn't say anything. She just leaned into me, her presence a solid anchor. I put my arm around her, pulling her close. The paramedics had stabilized Mr. Henderson and were loading him onto a gurney. His wife, clutching her purse, looked at me as they wheeled him past. Her eyes, red-rimmed and terrified, held mine for a second. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice cracking. I just nodded. As the paramedics exited and the doors swung shut, the silence lingered for another moment, then broke into a wave of murmured conversation. The spell was broken, but the atmosphere in the room was fundamentally altered. The loud, aggressive cheerfulness was gone, replaced by something quieter, more genuine. People began to approach me, not with the hesitant, pitying glances from earlier, but with firm handshakes and looks of admiration. "Incredible, Marcus. You kept your head when everyone else lost theirs. Is there anything you don't know how to do?" I accepted their words with a quiet nod, deflecting praise. Just glad I could help. I wasn't being modest, it was the truth. The action had been instinctive, the training reflexive. There was no victory in it, only a shared humanity. I caught sight of Brad across the room. He was standing alone near the podium, his untouched glass of champagne still in his hand. The triumphant speech he never got to finish seemed like a lifetime ago. He looked smaller somehow, the carefully constructed armor of his confidence visibly cracked. He was staring at the spot where Mr. Henderson had fallen, but I knew he was really seeing the effortless way a different kind of authority had taken command of the room, an authority earned not through deals and boasts, but through competence and calm under fire. Chloe was beside him, talking animatedly, but he wasn't listening. His kingdom of status had crumbled in the face of something real. Later, as the party began to wind down, I stood with Jenna and David near the exit. The weight of the night, the anxiety, the adrenaline crash, it should have left me drained. But instead, I felt a profound sense of calm. The ghost of the 18-year-old boy who had walked in here was gone, finally laid to rest. The glances I received now were not assessments of where I fit in an old hierarchy, but simple, unadorned respect. David clapped me on the shoulder. "Well, Thorne, you certainly know how to make an entrance. And an exit," he grinned. "Though next time, maybe just tell a funny story instead of performing emergency life-saving measures. You're a tough act to follow." Jenna squeezed my hand. "I'm proud of you," she said softly, her words meant only for me. I looked around the ballroom one last time. The disco ball was still turning, casting lazy specks of light over the emptying dance floor, but the room had lost its power over me. The sounds were just sounds now, the memories just memories. They didn't define me anymore. I was no longer the boy from the past, looking in from the outside. I was just Marcus Thorne, standing firmly in the present, anchored by the woman beside me, finally free. The air in the banquet hall had shifted from a raucous din to a low, weary hum. The DJ had long since packed up his flashing lights, and the dance floor was a ghost town of scuffed parquet and discarded cocktail napkins. The remaining clusters of people were smaller, more intimate, the forced cheer of the main event replaced by the soft murmur of genuine farewells or the clinking of glasses as final rounds were consumed. The scent of spilled beer and perfume was now overlaid with the tang of industrial-strength cleaner, as a lone staff member began the thankless task of clearing tables. Brad Thompson was holding court at our table, but his audience had dwindled to just Chloe, who was checking her reflection in the screen of her phone, and an older couple I barely recognized who were making polite, escape-ready noises. Jenna had her hand resting lightly on my forearm, her thumb tracing a slow, calming arc over my sleeve. David was leaning back in his chair, watching Brad with the detached amusement of a naturalist observing a particularly flamboyant species of bird. And that's when I told him, "The comps don't lie, Bill. You're looking at a 20% premium minimum," Brad concluded, slapping the table for emphasis. The sound was too loud in the thinning room. He scanned our faces, his eyes lingering on me for a beat too long. The unasked question from dinner. "So, Thorne, what was that government work anyway?" Still hung between us, a phantom limb of the evening's tension. I deflected it then with a noncommittal murmur, but Brad wasn't a man who liked loose ends. The older couple seized their moment, offering effusive goodbyes and promises to connect on Facebook before scurrying toward the exit. That left the five of us, Brad, Chloe, David, Jenna, and me. An island of our shared passed in a sea of empty chairs. Brad swirled the amber liquid in his glass, the ice cubes clinking a solitary tune. He looked from Jenna to me, his performative grin softening into something more calculating, more genuine. "Seriously, though, Thorne," he began, his voice lower, losing its salesman's boom. "Ranger School, Afghanistan, you really surprised everyone, Thorne." It wasn't an apology. It was an assessment, a recalibration. He was updating the internal ledger he kept on everyone, the social hierarchy that was his true religion. I could see the gears turning behind his eyes. My quietness in high school, which he'd mistaken for weakness, now had to be recategorized as something else. Something that demanded a measure of respect, or at least, a strategic acknowledgement. I just nodded, keeping my posture easy, my hands relaxed on the table. Jenna's thumb stilled on my arm, a silent signal of solidarity. "It wasn't something I planned on talking about," I said, my voice even. It was the truth. The accolades and the trauma were both too personal, too raw, to be used as social currency in a room like this. "Well, it's impressive," Brad conceded, the word seeming unfamiliar on his tongue. He glanced at Chloe, who looked up from her phone and offered a tight, polished smile. It really is, she chimed in. You must have some amazing stories. Her tone was the same one she'd used to compliment a well-decorated living room, pleasant, but devoid of any real comprehension of the foundation required to build it. Most of the good ones are classified, David deadpanned, breaking the tension with perfect timing. And the rest involve things I can't unsee, past the breadsticks. Jenna let out a soft laugh, and even I felt the corner of my mouth twitch. Brad looked momentarily thrown, then forced a chuckle. Right, well, anyway. He knocked back the rest of his drink and stood up, the movement signaling an end to the conversation. Good seeing you, Thorne, Jenna. Don't be a stranger, Chen. Chloe stood as well, smoothing her dress. Yes, it was so lovely catching up. We should all get together soon. The sentiment was as airy and insubstantial as her perfume. We exchanged the necessary pleasantries, the hollow take cares and drive safes that mark the end of a social obligation. I watched them walk away, Brad's arm slung possessively around Chloe's waist, his head already turning to scan the room for any other status updates he might have missed. He was already moving on, the challenge of my existence momentarily filed away under resolved non-threat. The moment they were out of earshot, a palpable silence descended over the three of us. It wasn't awkward, it was the quiet of a battlefield after the guns fall silent. David let out a long, low whistle. Well, that was a masterclass in passive-aggressive reconnaissance, he said, shaking his head. Brad Thompson, still trying to figure out if he's winning at life. Some things never change. He's just trying to make sense of you, Jenna said, turning to me. Her eyes were warm and knowing. You don't fit into the little box he had you in. It breaks his whole system. I looked at her, at the unwavering certainty in her gaze, and felt the last of the evening's tension drain from my shoulders. The rigid control I'd maintained all night, the hyper-awareness of every muscle and micro-expression around me, began to soften. This was real. This was my corner. I need air, I said, standing up. The chair scraped softly against the floor. I think we all do, Jenna agreed, gathering her purse. The three of us walked out of the banquet hall, leaving the ghosts of our 18-year-old selves behind. The transition from the artificially lit, climate-controlled interior to the warm, damp embrace of the summer night was jarring and welcome. The parking lot was still half full, and the sound of car doors slamming and engines starting echoed under the vast, star-dusted sky. The air smelled of rain-washed asphalt and distant honeysuckle. We stood for a moment in a loose circle under a buzzing sodium vapor light that painted our faces a pale orange. So, David said, shoving his hands into his pockets, that was the 15-year reunion. Verdict. It was informative, I said. Jenna laughed. That's one word for it. I think bizarre is another. Did you see Melissa Garrity's dress? I'm pretty sure it was made of actual glitter. A bold choice, David conceded, but not as bold as Brad's attempt to get Marcus to provide his full military service record for a peer review. He looked at me, his smirk fading into something more genuine. You handled that well, man. I would have been tempted to tell him exactly where he could stick his comps. It wasn't worth it, I said, and I realized I meant it. The old urge to prove myself, to quiet the nagging voice that had whispered I was less than them, was gone. It had been replaced by a simple, solid fatigue. It's just noise. Jenna slid her hand into mine, her fingers lacing through my own. Her touch was a grounding wire. It's just noise, she echoed softly. So what's the plan? David asked. Do we retreat to our respective bunkers and debrief, or do we extend the evening? I, for one, could use a beverage that doesn't come with a tiny paper umbrella. I looked at Jenna, who raised an eyebrow in a question. I nodded. There's a diner about 10 minutes from here, I suggested. The kind that's open all night. Bad coffee, good pie. David's face broke into a wide grin. Now you're speaking my language. Lead the way. The diner was a time capsule, all cracked red vinyl booths and chrome trim that had lost its shine decades ago. It smelled of stale coffee, frying bacon, and lemon-scented cleaner. We slid into a booth by the window, the fluorescent lights humming overhead. A tired-looking waitress with kind eyes brought us 3 mugs of coffee that was as strong as tar. For the next hour, we didn't talk about the reunion. We talked about David's latest project, a video game he was designing that involved historically accurate siege warfare. We talked about the absurdities of Jenna's work, the client who wanted a building shaped like a seashell. We talked about nothing of consequence and everything that mattered. The conversation was easy, punctuated by real laughter. It was the antithesis of the strained, performative chatter of the banquet hall. This was the connection that had been missing. Not the broad, shallow networking of a class reunion, but the deep, familiar comfort of people who knew you, the real you, not the persona you presented to the world. Sitting there, watching David animatedly sketch a trebuchet on a paper napkin, feeling Jenna's shoulder pressed against mine, I felt a sense of peace settle over me. This was my life. This was my team. The high school cafeteria, with its unspoken rules and brutal hierarchies, felt a million miles away. Later, as we said our goodbyes in the diner parking lot, the first hints of dawn were a faint lightening in the eastern sky. David clapped me on the shoulder. "Good to see you, Marcus, really. Let's not wait another 15 years, yeah." "Deal," I said, and I meant it. He waved to Jenna and got into his sensible sedan, pulling out of the lot with a final toot of the horn. We watched his taillights disappear down the road. The drive home was quiet. Jenna leaned her head against the window, her eyes closed, a small, contented smile on her face. I focused on the empty road stretching out before us, the rhythm of the tires on the pavement, a soothing mantra. The world was still and peaceful. A week passed. The reunion receded from a vivid, immediate memory into a collection of impressions, like a dream upon waking. Life returned to its normal rhythm, early morning runs, work on the house, quiet evenings with Jenna. But something had changed inside me. The event had acted like a catalyst, forcing a reaction I hadn't known I needed. It was a Tuesday evening. Jenna was at her drafting table in the next room, the soft scratch of her pencil a familiar, comforting sound. I was in my study, a small room lined with books. On the desk, 2 photographs sat side by side. One was from the reunion, a group shot the photographer had insisted on. There we were, Jenna and I, flanked by David and a few others. We looked happy, relaxed. My arm was around Jenna's waist, her head tilted toward mine. It was a picture of contentment. Next to it was my high school graduation photo. I was 18, my face thinner, my expression a mixture of apprehension and a desperate hope to be anywhere else. The suit was ill-fitting, the smile awkward and unsure. I looked like a kid playing dress-up, waiting for someone to see through the facade. I picked up the graduation photo, feeling the cheap cardboard frame under my fingers. The boy in that picture had been so consumed by what he was. He wasn't athletic like Brad, wasn't charismatic, wasn't part of the in-crowd. His life was a constant calculus of how to remain invisible, how to avoid drawing attention to his perceived inadequacies. His greatest ambition was to get through the day without a misstep. The government internship he'd been so proud of was, in truth, a soul-crushing exercise in filing paperwork, but he'd clung to it because it sounded important, because it was a shield against the question. "So, what are you going to do with your life?" I looked from that boy to the man in the reunion photo. The face was older, the lines around the eyes deeper, etched by sun and stress and things I would never talk about over canapés. But the eyes themselves were different. They were quieter. They were sure. The question Brad had asked, what was that government work, had felt like an insult at the time, a deliberate attempt to reduce me to that nervous intern. But now, a week removed, I saw it differently. It wasn't an insult. It was an opportunity. An invitation, clumsily and arrogantly delivered, but an invitation nonetheless. It was the chance to finally lay that old ghost to rest, not with a boast, but with a simple, unadorned truth. My silence hadn't been weakness then, and my quiet acknowledgement now wasn't a victory over Brad. It was a victory over the boy in the graduation photo. I hadn't needed to prove anything to Brad Thompson. I'd only needed to prove it to myself. And I had. The validation I'd craved for 15 years hadn't come from Brad's grudging respect or from the surprised looks around the table. It had been here all along, in the life I had built piece by piece. It was in the steady weight of Jenna's hand on my arm, in the easy camaraderie with a true friend like David, in the quiet discipline of a life lived on my own terms. I put the graduation photo back down on the desk. The past was a closed book, a fond, sometimes painful memory, but it held no power over me anymore. The tension I'd carried for weeks, the low-grade hum of anxiety about facing these people, was gone. In its place was a profound and peaceful closure. Jenna appeared in the doorway, leaning against the frame. Everything okay? I looked at her, standing in the soft light of the hallway, and felt a surge of gratitude so strong it tightened my throat. This was my success. This was my command post. Not a boardroom or a football field, but this quiet house, this unwavering partnership. Everything's good, I said, and my voice was steady, sure. I looked back at the two photos. The journey from one to the other had been longer and harder than anyone in that banquet hall could possibly imagine, but I had arrived. And as I sat there in the quiet of my study, I realized the smile on my face in the reunion photo wasn't one of triumph over an old rival. It was something quieter, something deeper. It was the smile of a man who had finally come home, not to a place, but to himself.